I hope you're enjoying my YouTube channel, Surowicz Watercolor. If you're not part of my mailing list, be sure to sign up to receive the latest information about my videos, online courses, workshops, coupons, and giveaways. You can find the link at the end of this video and in the description. Now let's start the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Mountain Lake. I didn't use a reference photo when doing this painting. Instead, I did a sketch and came up with a composition that I liked, mostly from imagination, but I glanced at a couple photos I had from a trip that I was on to get some ideas. And I'm working on a 7 by 10 inch sketchbook. This is a mixed media sketchbook with 98-pound paper on it. So it's not super heavy, but it's heavy enough to take the pen and ink and a light wash of watercolor. I'm doing my sketch with a micron pigment pen, which dries quickly and it doesn't bleed when you put a wash on it. And you can see this is a very simple sketch. I'm not trying to render anything in detail. I'm just focused on trying to indicate where some of the major shapes are and establish the spatial relationships between the various shapes. I place the trees, I get the placement where the trees are, and again, you can see that this is just a quick little sketch. You know, the trees are just almost symbols and little calligraphic marks. This is a sketch that you do in a couple minutes. If you're find yourself spending 8, 10, 15 minutes on one of these, you're spending way too much time on it. This is just a good place to do some problem solving and some exploration, try a few different things before you actually go to start your painting. And here I'm on the last box that I've drawn, and I may stop with these 4, or if I haven't come up with a solution for my composition and the process I'm going to take to actually execute the painting, I might do a few more of these. Now that I have my 4 sketches, I'm going to do a value study in the top right corner. I'm going to be using my Quill Brush, and I'll be using a middle value mixture of Paynes Gray. And I'm just going to block out some of the major shapes using this middle value wash. This is a good place to do some of your problem solving and experiment with your composition rather than trying to do it as you're trying to create a painting. When I do a value study like this, I don't do the whole range of values. I normally just have a middle value, a dark value, and the white of the paper, and sometimes a very light wash. You'll also notice that as I apply this wash, I'm not trying to paint objects, I'm painting large areas of value. So this middle value wash is going over the mountain, over the trees, over the land mass, and into the water, and I'm painting it as a large shape of value. I'm not trying to paint objects. This will give me enough information to move forward with my painting, and also might influence the approach that I'm going to take in my painting process. Now I've put down a middle value, I'm going to come in with a darker value. So you can see that the shapes that I'm painting are a little smaller than what I did with the middle value, but I'm still very liberal with the wash, still thinking shapes. And most importantly, thinking value. As I mentioned, I'm doing this with Paynes Gray. It's actually Winsor Newton Paynes Gray. I like the blue tint that their Paynes Gray has that some of the others don't. But you could do this with markers. There's a number of very nice warm and cool gray markers available that you can use. It works very well on this mixed media paper to do value studies, and you can use the warm and cool versions to enter that into the equation of your problem solving, decide where you want to have your warm and cool colors. This is the page in the sketchbook after I've done the value study and 2 color studies. I actually opted not to go with these 2, but it gave me some ideas for another one. And the one I moved forward with is similar to the bottom left. However, instead of using the orange tone, I opted to use a more of a red tone and a series of analogous green, blue-green colors also. This is my sketch for my painting. You can see it's very simple, very basic. I've used a B pencil on a quarter sheet, 11 inches by 15 inches. It's a 140-pound cold press, and I'll be working at about a 15 to 20 degree angle. When I'm working like this, all I'm concerned with for my sketch is to draw the major shapes and get the placement and positioning right. And when I draw the tree, I don't really draw a tree. I just pretty much put a vertical line again to indicate position and placement. A lot of this painting is going to develop with a brush, so I don't need a lot of detail in my pencil sketch. And I'm not trying to recreate a photograph. Before I begin, I'll go through the colors that I used. Cerulean blue, cobalt blue, royal blue, sap green, pyro red, quinacridone coral, alizarin crimson quinacridone, raw sienna, and raw umber. I'm going to begin by putting in a sky wash. And I'll be using 2 colors. I'll be using quinacridone coral and cerulean blue. I'm going to start on the left side using quinacridone coral first. This is a light to light middle value mixture of quinacridone coral. And I've put it in the sky, and at the same time I'm going to bring that down into the water because that water is going to reflect some of that color from the sky. Next I'm going to rinse my brush and load it with cerulean blue. I'm going to bring that from the right side of my page. So I'm using a 1-inch flat wash brush to do this. So the area on the left where I put the quinacridone coral is still very wet, and I'm coming in with this very wet wash of cerulean blue, and I'm bringing those 2 together and making a variegated wash. So I'm going to take that cerulean blue also down into the water. And just take that all the way down. I'm going to put a little bit more pigment in my mixture of cerulean blue. I'm going to do that at the bottom too. And you can see the paper, you can see the shine on the paper. This is saturated paper right now. I started wet on dry, but as I continue to add to the wash, I start working wet and wet. And it lets this nice gradation happen. And don't forget, my board is at a 15 to 20 degree angle, and that helps the gradation of the colors and gives a nice smooth transition. I'm going to freeze this frame for a minute, and one of the things I want to mention is you can see how this is a nice large wash. There's a lot of moisture in my brush. It's a saturated brush. The paper's saturated after I put it on there. And you didn't see any texture being created as I move my brush across the page because I have it fully loaded with as much paint as it can hold. And to do that, you have to have a nice pool of paint mixed on your palette. You can't get this kind of result with a teeny tiny brush and a little dab of paint on a little plastic palette. You need a big brush, and you need to mix large pools of color. And sometimes these particular mixtures have a lot of water in them. It's not pure pigment out of the tube, but it's a nice loaded brush going to the paper, and the paper is saturated. After I put this down there, you don't see any texture. You see this gradation because the paper is saturated, and that pigment can move with gravity to cause this nice gradation. My paper has been dried, and now I'm going to start working on some of these other shapes. Here there's a distant mountain, and I'm going to use a mixture of sap green and royal blue to give me a middle value blue-green tone. And I'm using my quill brush to do this, but once again my brush is loaded, and as that brush touches the paper, it starts to dispense the paint that I've picked up in my palette onto the paper. And you can see that again I'm getting some gradation because I started with the pigment, then I came back with a clear a brush loaded with clear water, and as I brought that down towards the base. Now I'm going to come in using my quill brush in a mixture that has some the same two colors, the sap green and royal blue, but it has more royal blue in it, so it's leaning more towards a darker bluer blue-green. And I'm working wet on wet right now. I put that wash on in the shape of the mountain, and now I'm laying in these tree shapes. It's just a big shape with just the indication of some treetops. And because I'm working wet on wet, I'm getting some nice soft edges to help me reinforce that feeling of distance. I'll come back in a few different times if I feel the need to, until I get the shape I'm after and until I get the value I'm after. Here I'm going to come back with a little darker value and put a few touches of that into this wash. So as this paper starts to dry a little bit, it's still very wet, but the longer it sits, the brush strokes will hold the shape a little bit better. So you can see I'm starting to give an indication of some distant trees overlapping this mountain shape. Now I'm going to put another layer of trees over top of the blue line of trees I just put in there. And this mixture still has sap green and royal blue, but it has much more sap green in it, and actually it now has some pyrrole red also. So you can see it's fairly dark there towards the bottom especially. But now I'm getting this green working wet and wet on top of this blue, and I'm going to also right there take some touches of the quinacridone and coral and touch it into this green while it's still wet, and it'll start to bring in my accent color, which is this quinacridone and coral. So for the most part I'm going to be working with an analogous color scheme for as far as dominance, but then I'm going to go across the color wheel and work with almost a split complementary color scheme here. But I'm going to use this quinacridone and coral as I have in the sky, but more as an accent color. So for the most part it's going to be blues, greens, blue greens, and there's going to be some accents of this quinacridone and coral red tone throughout. What I'm starting to do here is really build layers of these tree lines and mountain. So I started with the simple shape in the background of that mountain, and then I put in a soft edged line of trees using a bluer tone, and then I started to put another line of trees in front using a tone that's got more green in it. I make sure it has more green in it. Started putting some touches of red in it, and now actually I've got some raw sienna in my green mixture too that gives it a bit of a gold cast there, a gold green type tone. So the value is very close on all these, but how I start to differentiate them is more with temperature and color. So that distant tree line is a cool blue, and then I start to bring in some greens, a combination of warm and cool greens as I move across here, and bring in some touches of red. And here as I come across on this tree line, I'm going to reload my brush, and I'll start to come into the move forward in space, and I'm going to start to paint these trees that are starting to move more towards the middle ground. The first little point of land that sticks out has a couple trees on it, so now I'm going to start to paint those over top of what I've already painted. So some of what I have going on is wet on wet there, and some of it's wet on dry as I bring that down. I'm going to come back with a darker value mixture here, a little cooler. As I move through these areas with the trees and the land and these greens, I'll be using a variety of combinations of sap green, royal blue, pyro red, some raw sienna, and even some raw umber at times. So I'll experiment mixing some of those colors to give me a variety of middle value, warm and cool greens, dark value, warm and cool greens, and light washes if it's appropriate. But right now I'm still using my quill brush and using a dark value, and it's hard to see a little bit in the video probably, but within this dark value I have some quinacridone and coral to help carry that accent color through my painting. And I just want to soften that edge a little bit on the side, so I have a nice transition as I start to paint the trees that are to the left that will be in the foreground when I get there. Right now I'm going to move over to the right where there's a piece of land that sticks out and it has a couple trees on it. So continuing on with the same variety of color, you can see as you look across what I've painted there, the variety of greens and blue greens and blue tones that I've used, and you can see some of the accents of the quinacridone and coral that I've touched into the green. And here I'm putting some of that on the edge of this, just some touches of that coral. And it's all a very dark to dark middle value, but there's shifts of color happening within these shapes, so that while the shapes are the same value, the wash is a variegated wash with a variety of color within it. Right now I'm laboring using this quill brush because it's too small for the area I want to paint. So I'm going to switch to a large round wash brush here, and that's going to give me better coverage. You can feel it sometimes when you know you're laboring with a brush to cover an area. Just go to a larger brush. Try and use a variety of brushes. If you paint the whole painting with one brush, sometimes things will have a tendency to look the same, and you want to have some nice large brush strokes in some of your painting, and realizing that at times you're going to have a lot of small details and smaller brush strokes, more tight rendering style. But use a combination of large and small brushes as needed. And if you feel like you're laboring trying to cover an area, think about switching brushes. Now I'm going to start working on these trees on the left. I'm using a very dark mixture here. It has more royal blue in it, some raw umber, sap green, and even a touch of alizarin crimson. It gives me a nice dark value. And I've dried the rest of the areas that I've painted. So right now I'm working wet on dry. So it's going to give me hard edges as I make the brush strokes. And I'm going to bring this down, and the lower it gets, it's going to start to come together with the other tree and start to make more of a single shape, and then it'll just merge right into the piece of land as it goes down to the water. Once again, as the lower I get here, I'm starting to try to cover a bigger area, and I'm starting to labor with my brush, so I'm going to change that out here after I make a few marks, and use my jumbo round small wash brush. So I'm going to load that up, and then I'm going to use that to give me better coverage here. And I'm also, you can see that very dark value, but I want to bring some of the quinacridone and coral into that. So it's hard to differentiate because they're both such a dark value. But I'm bringing in accents of the quinacridone and coral right on the edge, and it becomes more evident when it starts to dry. If you look on the right there where I've done that, you can see that coral tone coming through in spots on that green. I'm going to continue on using this jumbo round small wash brush, and you can, it still has it comes to a fairly decent point, so you can do some of this brush work with it, and then when needed it gives nice coverage on the larger shapes. So this wash is it's been very dark value, but I've lightened it up just a little bit as I've moved to the left, and I'm going to come back in and work in a little darker value. So you can see a nice coverage. There's no texture being created. I'm not using a dry, low moisture brush. I have a lot of pigment in there when I applied it to these areas, even in my smaller brush. Now I'm going to take my quill brush, and I have a dark value here similar to what I was just using, and I'm just painting in some smaller evergreens, just to add a little bit to the composition, a little variation, so they're not all just big trees the same size. I have some little ones in there, and I'll come in also and just give the indication of a few of the old snags, they call them, where they're just kind of a dead tree with some branches hang off of them. Here I'm just trying to help define the edge a little better on the one tree as it relates to the other one there in that middle ground there. They're all running together, but I wanted just a little bit more distinction that there's two trees there. There's an edge that wasn't very evident. I'm going to go back there in the background a little bit with a cool blue tone, and I'm just giving a little bit crisper indication of a few of those trees in the distance. They're still distance, they're just subtle suggestions of value, but they're a cool tone. And I'm going to take a light middle value wash. I'm going to put a little bit of a tree line here to give the suggestion that there's a few trees here behind this mass of trees that I have, and you can differentiate them because you can see the change in value and the color itself. Now I'm going to start thinking a little bit about reflections, and I'm going to give an indication of this mountain reflecting in the water before I do some of the other reflections. So just a slight indication of the reflection of that mountain. I want to get a little bit bluer tone in there. What's a blue-green, and want to help soften that going back. I'm actually going I'll blot that a little bit, but I'm actually going to take my spray bottle, the Fine Mist spray. I'm going to break that up just a little bit, just a few breaks in the edge there, and create a little bit of soft edge, and give the indication more of some verticality to that reflection. So here it's dry. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some lifting. I've got just a little bit less than a 1/2 inch angled nylon brush, and it's damp. It's not dripping with water, it's just damp. So I'm just agitating that paint a little and then blotting it with a Kleenex and just lifting to give an indication of some tree trunks. This works pretty well, especially with darker shapes, or when you have darker washes on the paper, because you get greater contrast. And like I said, you don't want to put a lot of water in your brush. It just needs to be damp, so it's damp enough to agitate the paint, but you don't want a bead that's just going to just roll off your brush and dispense onto the paper, because you're not going to get a crisp edge to give the suggestion of that tree trunk. You're going to get just some water starting to run, and it'll make just a spot on your paper. So here, and it's important too, just to take that tissue and blot it, or even strike it, just to help remove that loose paint. Now I'm going to take a rigger brush with a dark value on it. It's the same types of dark values I've been using. And I'm going to paint alongside and on top of some of these areas where I lifted, just to give the suggestion more of some of it's in shadow, helps reinforce the contrast between that, and then also paint over top in some spots to break that up a little bit more. Than if it got a little too long when I was lifting and I want to have an interruption, I use it for that. And then I'm also going to take this rigger and give the indication of just some dark tree shapes here that are, these are some of the old snags that just dried dead trees that you see standing in some of these heavily wooded areas. Just a couple of them. Yeah, just make a trunk and then just a few branches coming off at different angles and different spacing. You don't want it to look like a picket fence on its side. You want to vary the shape and the spacing of the marks you're making. And I'm going to come over here and give the suggestion that there's one on the other side of these large trees that are here, but it's just peeking through. And I'm going to put another one here just off to the right of that big tree, and you can just see just the elements of the branches sticking out. Next, I'm going to start working on some of the reflections in the water. So I have a 1/2 inch flat brush here, and I've loaded it up with a very light valued tone of green. It has just enough that I can really see where I'm putting it, but I'm going to introduce some stronger colors into these areas. So I'm putting these horizontal brush marks in using my 1/2 inch flat brush. And so it's very wet, but I'm going to come back and I'm going to introduce some of the colors that are in the mountain and in the surrounding trees, and then you'll see how that just starts to dissolve into that area, because it's wet on wet right now. So I put down a wash, wet on dry, and I'm coming back into it with some darker value colors to give the suggestion of reflection. And I didn't just paint the whole area wet. There's breaks in between the brush marks, so it feels more like it's reflection, and it's being broken up by the ripples of the water. And as I drop these colors in here, I'm trying to match it up with what's going on behind it in the shore, so that it gives that suggestion that the trees and the land, everything behind it is what's being reflected down into the water. And I'm getting nice soft edges because I'm working wet on wet. Now I'm continuing with more of the same. So still the same 1/2-inch flat brush, and these marks need to be horizontal because as the sky is reflected into the water, it tends to be horizontal, and when objects are being reflected, they tend to be more vertical in nature. And here I'm going back and putting in some darker greens. I try to carry that down. And I like to take this spray and just break that up a little and bring it down vertically to make it feel like it's this kind of soft reflection, but it's vertical because that's how things reflect to you. Now I'm going to move to the right side here and just repeat the same process. I'm putting in a horizontal wash here with breaks in between using this 1/2-inch flat brush. And then I'm going to come back and drop in some of those colors that are reflecting from the shoreline. And you'll notice I put in those horizontal brush marks of moisture with my 1/2-inch flat brush, but as I come back in to drop these colors in, I'm just using a number 4 round brush. I could use my flat brush too, but it's a good size for the areas that I'm working in, and it puts just enough down without overdoing it in any one particular area. I'm going to drop a little bit more color in there, a little darker value. I'll take that to the edge. You want to make sure you include the edge in your composition and things aren't floating. And here again, I'm taking this fine mist spray and I'm dragging some of that color down with a spray to give this vertical element to the composition. Now I'm going to move over to the left side, and I'm going to continue using the 1/2-inch flat brush. I could switch to a 1-inch flat brush at this point. It'd probably be a little better, but I don't want to overdo it in a few of these areas. Some of these areas I have a very fine break in between the areas where I'm applying the water. I say water, I'm applying a light green wash. Gives a little bit of color to it, and I can see where it's at. And then I'm going to come drop in some of these darker values and the variety of color that matches up with what's being reflected from the shoreline. I'm going to come and drop some more of the darker value colors in there. And I'm using the jumbo round wash brush here. It's a larger area, and I wanted just to drop a little bit more paint in there, but I could have stuck with a number 4 round if I wanted. So I'm also going to I want to drop a little bit more of that red tone in there because that's going to reflect down. You can see I've done that on the right. So this is a much darker value reflecting down. And here I'm going to put in some touches of this quinacridone and coral, just to let you know that it's there and that it's reflecting down into the water. And once again, I like to take this spray bottle and repeat that same technique so that it complements what's going on the other side of my composition. I want it to be darker on this side. That mass of trees that's right above this is much darker in value and would be reflecting darker colors down into the water. So now that everything is dry, I want to go back and I want to put a darker value in this area. And I'm working wet on dry at this point because I dried my paper completely. So now I'm working wet on dry, and I'm using this 1/2 inch flat brush to lay down this darker value. And I want to bring this all the way to the edge. Again, you don't want to feel like your composition is floating. The edges are part of your composition, so you need to include them in your painting, involve them, I should say. And here I'm taking the fine mist spray again and spraying through this area where I just laid down this darker value, and it brings in some more of this vertical element. And I'm just going to put some touches. I want to carry this value out in a few spots here, a little darker value, just a touch here and there. And again, I'm going to soften some of this up and draw some of this color down with a vertical motion. I want to pick up the indication of that tree trunk reflecting down into the water. So I'm going to do some lifting, just as I did on the trees themselves. I'm doing some lifting into the reflection to give the suggestion that is just that light tone is reflecting down into the water. Here I'm going to take some touches of cerulean blue and strengthen that feeling of reflected light from the sky, that sky tone. I want to carry some of that color over to the more towards the foreground a little bit, and I'm going to bring it over towards the other side so that I have this color working throughout the composition. It echoes some of those blue tones in the distant mountains in the sky, and I'm going to soften that with a spray bottle. The values and the white being reflected in the water in the background, it looks very similar to what's going on in the foreground, and it gets confusing when you're trying to determine what's close and what's far away. So I'm going to glaze over this area in the foreground with this blue to pick up the reflection from the sky, but I'm going to leave some of that white tone, the light of the paper, there more in the distance. So now I can start to differentiate where each of these areas are in space a little better. And I'm going to put a white mat on this to get it framed up. And there's my painting, Mountain Lake. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. And if you ever have questions about my materials, you can always go to the studio page of my website, rsurowiczart.com. If you have questions, you can email me at contact@rsurowiczart@gmail.com. And at the end of this video, there'll be a series of links that would take you to my mailing list, to my online learning center, and to some of my previous videos.